Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to a Better Tech Economy webinar. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes as we wait for the room to fill in. So feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. We'll get started shortly. I'll keep repeating this message just a couple of times. Hello, everyone. For those of you that are just joining us, we're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for the room to fill in. Grab some water if you'd like, a drink, and we'll get started shortly. And I'll keep repeating this message a couple of times. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're just giving it about one more minute before we get started. Cool, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining our Intro to a Better Tech Economy webinar. Hope you all can hear and see me. My name is Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity Collaborative, and in my role, I get to engage with our supporters and our base through our campaigns and organizing efforts, and now I get to engage with you all here. So feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screens. But we're not going to answer any of those questions until the end of the presentation. Should be a quick presentation, trying to aim to wrap up by 12:30. The webinar is being recorded and it is going to be sent out to all of you via email, along with a copy of the slides and relevant links to some of the things that we'll be talking about today. So what are we talking about? Well, we're going to discuss, some of the community tensions with tech, bad policy choices that have predated tech's arrival, how tech equity fits in to combat some of these issues. And lastly, we'll talk about some solutions we've identified that can help support to ensure that our tech economy is working for everyone. And so let's start off with the tensions with tech. Well, communities are frustrated with tech, and it really comes to no surprise. We've seen that when tech shoulders the blame, it starts to create this us versus them dynamic that's further dividing our communities. And personally, for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've kind of been able to witness this firsthand. I have friends and family who are, worried about the changes they're seeing in their communities, what that means for their homes, for their jobs, for every aspect of their lives, but also have friends and family who, are pursuing jobs within the tech industry and have found lots of success for themselves and for their families alike. And unfortunately, as the tech sector continues to expand, especially accelerated by remote work into other cities across the country, we're seeing that many of the inequities that are experienced in the Bay Area are beginning to replicate elsewhere in other people's communities. And so how did we get here? Well, we know that tech did not start this level of pain our community has been facing for years. Inequities have been in our economy and our society for decades, even when Silicon Valley here in the Bay Area was still farmland. And all of these feelings of frustration are understandable, like we just talked about. There really isn't a doubt that tech has exacerbated inequality, but tech didn't start all of these issues. And so over the last couple of decades, there has been this overall shift in the balance of power that has hindered our community's abilities to prosper and survive. So let's talk about what we've seen historically. As we can see in this chart, our government has cut funding for many social programs throughout the years, from food security and art programming to housing security and medical needs. Our neighbors are being slowly deprived of resources to live healthy and stable lives. And the shift in power has really benefited corporations. While the government has been cutting back on social programs, or simultaneously we're cutting taxes for large corporations around the 80s. And individual tax rates have been following the same trajectory. That's that blue line, but we see that corporate taxes have been on a steady decline. That's that orange line at the bottom of the screen. And just to put that in perspective, in 2019, 49% of our tax revenue, around $626 billion was collected from individuals in comparison to only 5%, $59 billion coming from corporations. And these tax cuts and increase in profits for companies have come at the expense of workers and their voice. We know that corporations have this long history of suppressing worker voice and worker power, and there are numerous accounts of union busting and strategic attacks on worker-centered organizations that have only reinforced this profit over people approach. And a combination of all this has led to this shift in power that's still disproportionately impacting people in our economy today. Corporations have begun to flex this shift in power by entering communities and buying up apartments and homes in an effort to maximize profits. And we're seeing that corporations' bad practices as new landlords through inaccurate background checks, predatory ownership schemes, and exclusionary lending. And they've begun to reinforce the racist and exclusionary housing practices of the past, also known as redlining. So in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color in the Bay Area and across the country. And that policy is redlining. Redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And the policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. And on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined. As we can see with the image on the screen, all the way on the left is a map of Seattle with historically redlined neighborhoods. And those communities that were deemed risky for investment or redlined didn't receive investment at all. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color, and there really is by no accident, the hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. So in other words, redlining was a discriminatory policy and a racist policy, and it made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or for maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. And there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification. And on top of these exclusionary zoning policies, it's simply just too expensive to build affordable homes in our country today. If we take, for example, in San Francisco, it costs around $1.2 million to build one unit of housing. And even if more housing does get built, tenants are not being protected enough to be able to remain in their homes. You know, we've seen that the eviction rates and displacement rates continue to increase heavily over the years. And families have been pushed into the outer edges of our major cities, further away from job centers and resources. And in New York, the weakened tenant laws have drastically led to a decrease in homes being available for people. And evictions are not just happening in expensive areas like San Francisco and New York, but also in up and coming tech cities like Atlanta. You know, eviction rates across the country are continuing to push out our most vulnerable community members away. And on top of that, tenants have little to no power in order to combat these evictions. And they also lack that power in their jobs. As we can see here, the hourly pay for workers has not increased much the last couple of decades, even though productivity has dramatically increased. According to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers that's covered by a collective bargaining agreement or unions dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019, meaning that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. And this means that employees have less bargaining power to advocate for pay rates that are more in alignment with the work that they're delivering. And not having this ability to speak up in this worker voice to address worker injustices has led to constant disturbing stories about worker conditions. And we're hearing about disturbing workplace practices that are putting workers at risk, both physically and mentally. And a lot of the times, the workers that are the most impacted are contract workers or people performing ghost work. Ghost work is it's a term that's used to describe the kind of work that feels like it's being automated, but in reality, there's a person behind the scenes performing these tasks. In our research on contract workers in tech, we found that contract workers receive fewer benefits and are paid less than tech employees, while doing the same work as their directly employed counterparts, and that these workers are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, Latino, Asian, women, and non-binary people. And it's a little out of context that the tech industry came to power and cemented itself as the engine of our current economy. The tech industry, positioned as arguably the most powerful tech sector of American business, requires that they do take some responsibility for how the economy has grown and is growing. And in addition, tech should employ some business practices or create products that are directly impacting the economic health of our communities. If we look at the top companies in our economy today, tech does own a lot of the market share. There's some familiar faces on there: Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon. And like we've talked about, tech didn't create social and economic inequity in the US, but it has had a role in worsening inequity and does have a responsibility to fix it. At TechEquity Collaborative, our community of tech workers, activists, community members, and advocates have the civic power to help rebalance that power within and outside of the tech industry. And we identify and uncover overlooked issues of inequity so you can champion for some of the solutions. How does tech equity work? Well, our goal at Tech Equity is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. We believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. And we help our community approach these big problems and engage in systems change in three major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live. We do this through book club discussions, panel discussions, webinars such as this one, voter guides, blogs, just a lot of content that we're producing around education. We also advocate for public policy that's rebalancing power and building economic equity in response. And a perfect example of that is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which we worked alongside community members, legislators here in California, and on-the-ground organizations to help pass this law, which now extends protections to 8 million California renters, preventing unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. And finally, there's corporate practice, aiming to turn companies into agents of equity in the broader community through our corporate partnerships and engagements. So what are issues that we're seeing within tech and as a result of tech that we can address? Well, within the tech sector, we see that there's large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse, and contracted workers. Temporary, contract, and contingent workers who are hired through these contracting agencies are often doing the same work as their directly employed peers while making less money, receiving fewer benefits, and are experiencing career immobility. And at Tech Equity, we've done research known as the Contract Worker Disparity Project to help uncover some of these issues. And at the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And we worked on the Pay Transparency for Pay Equity Act last year, also known as SB 1162, to address some of these inequities within the tech industry. And there's also inequities as a result of tech that we've been working on. Tech has produced a lot of wealth, but that wealth has exacerbated our communities, and people have been displaced. Homes have become more expensive, and however, we can repurpose this wealth to strengthen tenant protections, produce more affordable housing, and help communities organize around policies that are changing the ownership structure back into the hands of the people instead of corporations. And we've tackled this issue through some of our work on Prop 13 reform. And next up, we have the impact of tech products. Prop tech is accelerating corporate takeover of single-family starter homes and renting at a mass scale. And these new companies, are venture-backed, are digitally enabled, and they play an increasingly influential role in our economy. From new modes of housing construction to automated home buying, these tech-enabled companies promise to scale to massive market share and reap higher valuations along the way. So we have to be thoughtful about how we can work with companies to not reinforce biases in these products. And we're working on this already through our Tech Bias and Housing Initiative. And finally, we're building tools, visualizations, and apps to support the movement for economic justice. You can join our team of volunteer researchers, designers, coders, data analysts to collaborate on tough problems and share these skills. For example, we've had volunteers in the past help us build out a website that renters can use to find out if their landlord's rent increase was illegal and how to get help and resources. This year at TechEquity Collaborative, our key initiatives begin with the Contract Worker Disparity Project, which I kind of talked about earlier. It's a first of its kind worker-centered initiative that sheds the light on the practice of contracting out and proposes and advocates for public policy solutions and partners with companies to adopt responsible contracting practices. We have the Tech Bias in Housing Initiative, which examines the promises and perils of housing technology. We're aiming to ensure that these technological innovations in the housing space do not reinforce some of the racist housing systems and policies of the past. And finally, we have the Housing Data Initiative, which, passing good policy is meaningless if those policies aren't implemented well. And together with our coalition of partners and government officials, we identify where tech can be a lever for smart policy implementation, and we enlist our tech workers to build, the tools that move us from talk to action. And so what can you do today? You can sign up to become a civic tech volunteer and flex your skills. You can tell your friends about our work. You can contribute to the organization, or you can join me for a one-on-one conversation. I do host 30-minute one-on-one conversations via Zoom if you're just interested on a specific campaign, on a topic, if you want to find out a little bit more about TechEquity Collaborative, or if you're just confused on what route you want to take within the organization, feel free to email me, respond back to that email I send out afterwards, and we can set up a time to talk. So now, that was quite a bit of information. Like I said, it's pretty quick presentation, so I'll take a minute or two to see if anyone has any questions. Like I said, the webinar was recorded, and we'll send out a follow-up email afterwards with some links to this. And you can also feel free to use that email to reply to if you have a question later in the day. Cool. So I'm not seeing any questions. I want to thank you all so much for your time, during your lunch break. We hope you feel inspired to join this growing movement. Keep an eye out on that email. Respond back if you do have a question, or if you do want to set up some time to talk one-on-one. So I want to just thank you all, and keep an eye on the email. Thank you.